God, on this Easter morning, might you help us see. Might you help us hear as you call our names. Might you help us turn and experience resurrection. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, my friends, on this Easter morning, we may find ourselves standing at the empty tomb, just like Mary, with our own questions, our own tears, and our own experiences of darkness. We may come seeking a Jesus who does not fit our expectations, and yet we come because we trust that something transformative happens when we encounter the risen Lord. Throughout this Lent, we have lived with questions. And now, as we step into Eastertide, the question is not whether we will keep asking them, but how. Will we continue to seek the miracle of God's newness? And will we keep looking for Jesus? These are not abstract or theoretical questions. These are the questions that shape our lives and our faith. And often, we ask them without having the full picture, while we learn to live faithfully even when our understanding is incomplete. In the midst of all of our questions, the ones that we brought during Lent and perhaps the ones that we bring today, two for me rise from this gospel story. The first is, why are you weeping? And the second, who are you looking for? Or more directly, as the Aramaic asks it, who do you want? I think this is a question that cuts to the heart of our human experience because it names our pain and at the same time invites honesty with ourselves and with God. So to our first question, why are you weeping? That's not a question to ask, why are you weeping? But why are you? Are you grieving someone that's been lost? Living with illness or loving someone who is? Carrying the weight of job loss or uncertainty about the future? Watching a changing world and wondering where you belong in it? Perhaps feeling the strain of a faith that doesn't quite hold you the way it once did. Are you feeling lonely? Or experiencing fear for your children or grandchildren who must inherit a world filled with so much pain? Why are you weeping? You see, to ask that question and answer it truthfully is not a lack of faith, for we see in the gospel story it is one of the very things that Mary carries with her. To ask that question and answer it is an act of both truth and love. In fact, faith often begins in the space where we don't have clear answers, in the space where grief is deep, and where we're still trying to discern what is real and what is true and where God might possibly be in the midst of it. But my friends, questions and grief are fertile grounds for resurrection. I have found that my own questions, and I have plenty of them, have never led me away from faith, but actually deeper into it. And I found that the times that I've tried to avoid them have really only left me stuck. But when I stay with them and lean into them and embrace the unknowing and the uncertainty and the messiness of it all, I find that over time, something within me shifts. And often it's only in hindsight, but as I look back at the tombs of my life, I can see now, not then, but now how God had been at work, slowly bringing understanding by helping me live my own questions. Poet R.S. Thomas, in his poem The Answer, writes, "There have been times when, after long on my knees, in a cold chancel, a stone has rolled from my mind, and I have looked in and seen the old questions lie, folded and in a place by themselves, like the piled grave clothes of love's risen body." I think it's important for us to remember that Easter begins in darkness and in fear and in pain. Not just Good Friday or Holy Saturday. Easter morning begins in darkness. John begins our Easter story by describing while it was still dark. And in John's gospel, darkness is never just about a time of day. It's about a place of not yet seeing, not yet understanding, not yet believing. Frederick Buechner calls it the darkness of the resurrection itself, a time when it's hard to be sure what you are seeing. And that is where Easter begins. And if we're honest, that can feel entirely frustrating. Why doesn't the resurrection arrive in blazing clarity? Why all this uncertainty? Why all this stumbling around in the darkness? As Mary encounters our risen Lord, he doesn't appear to her in a blaze of glory, but in such an ordinary way, she thinks he is a gardener. Perhaps such that he still has the dirt from the grave under his fingernails. Which brings us to our second question. Who are you looking for? Part of what makes Easter difficult is that we want resolution, but instead we're given a story full of uncertainty, where people in this story are still trying to understand what has happened, working with partial information and different assumptions. Mary's not sure, the disciples aren't sure. We find them later in the gospel reading next week, hidden up in a room after the resurrection has occurred, because no one can quite figure out what exactly is going on here. And notice that Mary is not neutral in her confusion. She tells a story to try and explain what she thinks she sees. They have taken him, she says. She assumes loss and absence and the worst. And yet it is precisely there that resurrection begins. I have learned in many difficult ways that clarity and hope and healing often require us to spend time in those difficult and desolate and dead places where easy answers don't work and platitudes aren't going to cut it. We might not fully understand resurrection, but I wonder if we can trust that God brings new life out of death. We may wonder, is resurrection even real? Can we build our lives on this hope? And those are honest questions, because resurrection is a bold thing to believe, my friends, but it is an even bolder thing to live. Perhaps the power of this story is that it reaches into the deepest parts of us, to the places where both doubt and faith live. Because the opposite of doubt is not faith, it is certainty. Our questions do not weaken our faith. They bear witness to the magnitude of what we are trying to hold and live. Martin Copenhaver writes, "So the place to begin in the life of faith is not necessarily with those things we never doubt. What we proclaim at Easter is too mighty to be encompassed by certainty, too wonderful to be found only within the borders of our imaginations. Which means that being a community of faith, a community of resurrection, is being a community learning to trust God and one another, even when we only see in part, even when we don't know the end of the story. And sometimes, like Mary, we must linger in the darkness in order to even recognize resurrection. Mary does not recognize Jesus at first. The disciples are afraid, nothing seems clear, and still in the midst of this, Christ is present and meets us there in that early morning darkness. He may not look the way we expect. He does not neatly fit our assumptions, but he appears and he calls our name. I think what gives me the most hope, particularly about John's version of the resurrection, is that it's not sight that leads Mary to recognition. It's relationship. It's being known. She recognizes Jesus not when she sees him, but when he calls her by name. Because she's been called that name by him before. Because she recognizes the relationship, even as she doesn't quite recognize the man. I also find it interesting that Jesus tells Mary not to hold on to him after she realizes who she is. And this always seems like kind of an abrupt part of the story. And I wondered, is Jesus rejecting Mary? But as I dug deeper, I realized he's not. He is simply redirecting her. You see, the relationship that they have always had will continue, but in a new form that she cannot yet control or understand. And I wonder if Jesus says, don't hold on to me, because he didn't want Mary to hold on to the way things were, but instead to allow something new, as risky and uncertain as it may seem, to spring forth. A new way of understanding, a new way of relating, a new way of trusting what God is doing even when it wasn't fully clear yet. In a beautiful essay on the resurrection, theologian and writer Chris Barnes reminds us of what actually matters during Holy Week. He says the question that Easter asks of us is not, do we believe in the doctrine of resurrection? Frankly, belief by itself is not particularly hard. But what the Gospels ask is not, do you believe, but have you encountered the risen Christ? Friends, this morning, we are not being asked to assent intellectually simply to a doctrine. We are being asked, have we seen the risen Christ, and will we live in that resurrection? And that encounter with the risen Christ rarely comes with full explanation. Sometimes it comes just in moments, in glimpses. I had people this week speaking into my life, reminding me, look for the glimpses of resurrection, even in the death and despair of Holy Week. Sometimes that comes even just in the quiet recognition that Christ is present, even when we're still making sense of it all. And so this response to why be a Christian is not simply belief, but experience. It is because I have seen the Lord. But that kind of seeing, that requires risk. The risk of holding on to hope when it feels very fragile. The risk of staying present in the darkness, the risk of turning toward the voice that calls our name. And maybe this is where we are this Easter. not beyond our questions, but in the midst of them, not with full clarity, but perhaps with just enough light to take the next step towards Jesus. Because as we've seen, even in the Gospels, even with the people who walked side by side with Jesus for 3 years, most of them don't understand right away. Most of them don't believe right away. Many of them hesitate and need more time. And what we see is a community learning to live into the good news of resurrection together. And so this is the strange and honest truth of Easter. New life does not emerge from neat or orderly places. It comes from disruption. It comes from grief. It comes from confusion. It comes from death. It comes from a world that no longer makes any sense. My friends, I have to be honest, the greatest moments of resurrection for me have come from the times of the greatest disorientation, the greatest uncertainty, the places where I said, there is no way God can act. There is no way God can make a path. There is no way God can make something new. There is no way God can turn this around. And those answers didn't come in blazing glory. They came in small glimpses over time. I've seen this as well in my incarcerated students. I had the privilege of doing some really incredible work with them this past year. And I remember one of them, during our first class, I teach spiritual formation using improv, and we were looking at how it could be a disruptor for hope. And I had a student come up to me on my first day and say, I don't have any hope. My situation is hopeless. I don't know how to hope. I'm tired of hope. And I said, that's true. And his answer didn't come in blazes of glory, bright, shining appearances, but in small glimpses over our time together in community of the ways in which a community held him up, in small moments of respite and joy, in small steps in his story of believing that perhaps he could be more than the worst thing he had ever done. And by the end of the semester, he was able to say to me, I can joke about hopelessness while still finding hope in my story. You see, this is exactly where resurrection begins. Not after the chaos settles, right in the middle of it. Because resurrection is not God's reward for everything finally coming together. It is God's work of bringing life out of what has already fallen apart. It is God meeting us in disorientation and patiently, slowly calling us forward into something new, even if that newness is not always obvious. And it doesn't resolve every question, but it is real. Which means that the good news of Easter is that the places that feel the most uncertain, the most unsettled, the most chaotic, the most dead are not signs of God's absence. They are the very places that God is at work. I'm going to share a poem called Lost and Found, and it's by Sarah Speed. Mary wept, standing in the garden, soft dirt under her feet, sun still tucked away, sleeping under the horizon. The other disciples left, but Mary stayed. Mary wept, shoulders shaking, tears running down her face. She said, "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they put him." But here's what Easter taught me. If you think you've lost God, if it feels like heaven has slipped through the cracks, if you feel like the night will never end, then know there is no hide and seek with the divine that does not end in you being found. Stay still. Keep breathing. God is closer than you think. So, my friends, this Easter, we do not wait for everything to make sense in a chaotic and broken world. We instead listen for the voice that calls our name. We take the next step, and we trust that even here, even now, resurrection is already unfolding. Alleluia. Christ is risen.